Greetings, family. Welcome to African Esquire TV. I'm your host, Tierney Cherie. Before we get started with today's video, if you're watching on my YouTube channel, please do like, comment, and subscribe. And also hit the notification button so that you'll get updates whenever I post a broadcast. Also, if you could please add yourself to my Telegram. Telegram is a decentralized platform that I update regularly whenever I post a video or do a live or any type of speaking engagement. In addition, please add yourself to Odyssey. Odyssey is essentially the same thing as YouTube, but it is decentralized. And so the links to all of those are down below. So what we're going to talk about today is the plethora of Pan-Africanist propaganda that gets to be used against our liberation, but how those things are never consistent with what true Pan-Africanism is. We're going to talk about this specifically in the context of Ghana. Now, I already know a lot of people jump on me whenever I want to talk about Ghana, particularly the ruling party in Ghana and the president in Ghana, Nana Akufo-Addo. But there's some things that are happening that we have to really evaluate whether or not we're committed to the true essence of Pan-Africanism. The true essence of Pan-Africanism being the unity of the colonized African people against the colonial system. If that's not what is encompassed inside of your definition of Pan-Africanism, then what you're actually advocating for is a flowery and more acceptable mainstream version of Pan-Africanism. Something that's been very popular nowadays. Many people call themselves Pan-Africanists, but are not critical of the capitalist system. I say, how? How could you be a Pan-Africanist and not be critical of the capitalist system in Africa, which has never, ever produced anything of worth for African people inside of the continent? It's funny, whenever I tell people I'm a socialist, some will say things like, oh, what has socialism done for Africa? I can point to the pre-colonial years, where if you look at the economic systems of Africa, they were living a socialist existence. Socialism is the word that is given to any system where the means of production, meaning land, resources, anything that's used to produce the products or the items that we need, where those are owned communally. Well, if you consider the fact that that was already the setup inside of Africa prior to colonialism, then you understand that socialism does not have to prove that it works for Africans. Capitalism, however, does have to prove, because every single country inside of Africa where capitalism has existed has led to the destruction of the masses, even if you see a very well-painted bourgeoisie. And that is the case for the country of Ghana and many other countries inside of the African continent, where capitalism is allowed to reign freely, is allowed to be in existence and intact, and yet the system does not actualize benefits for the masses of Africans. So let's focus specifically on Nana Akufo-Addo, and we're going to connect this to the news story that a Liberian settlement in Ghana, which has been in place since the 90s, is essentially being torn down. Now, Nana Akufo-Addo, we know that he is one of the favorites, I would say the favorites of certain Pan-Africanist platforms, because he's willing to say things that are critical against forces that we identify as being our enemies. I would say correctly identify, but we do not necessarily analyze what he's saying as to whether it actually is a challenge against the colonial system or is a well-painted plead for the colonists to please do right by us that is not backed by any power.
I hope that the comments I'm about to make will not offend the questioner too much and some people around here. All of us. I think that as Africans, as Ghanaians, and not, when I say so with the greatest of respect to the French president, I think that the cooperation of France is something that I am, as you know, a strong friend of France. I am Francophile, so I don't have any difficulty with that. But I'm talking about our own propulsion, what we need to do to get our countries to work so that we can create the conditions that would allow our young people to forego this hazardous effort to get to Europe. They're not going there because they want to. They're going there because they don't believe they have any opportunities in our countries. So that should be our focus. And I believe that with that if we change that mindset of dependence, that mindset which is contingent on aid and charity, we would see that in the decades ahead of us, the full flowering of the African peoples will take place. And that new African personality that was talked about at the time of our independence will become real and imminent in our times. That's what I'm saying. I hope that I'm not upsetting the questioner or even some of my friends who are here.
Recently, the United Nations held their conference, and Nana Akufo-Addo was there with a number of other African leaders, and he was stressing the role of the ECOWAS inside of the region. If you don't know, the ECOWAS, which is the regional West African bloc of West African nations, is now headed by Nana Akufo-Addo. And this has to, of course, bring in a lot of issues, because what we've seen the ECOWAS doing is trying to thwart any efforts of the people to push out neo-colonial leaders, because they understand that those leaders are a part of their system, which they want to uphold. So him being the head of that body should have us understand that he's not someone who is making decisions for the betterment of African people on a continent-wide basis, because we've seen consistently that ECOWAS have turned a blind eye when the people have risen up against their leaders who have been corrupt, who have been sold out to the West, who have jeopardized their freedom, their human rights. ECOWAS have been silent. And whenever those people are the subject of a coup, all of a sudden the ECOWAS has something to say about these human rights atrocities. In the case of Guinea, for example, or Mali, we have seen that the ECOWAS have acted to shut them out, to close the borders, have given all these sanctions and things that they would never do if it was for the human rights of the people on the ground, but they'll do it to preserve the colonial system on the continent. These are contradictions of the ECOWAS, and he's the head of this body. Now, at the United Nations, he actually stressed that the ECOWAS have given Guinea 6 months, okay, and requested the immediate release of President Alpha Conde. If you don't know, President Alpha Conde, they were trying to get him out of power. And I understand there's been a lot being said about the coup leaders. I personally don't have any information to substantiate whether or not the coup leaders are sponsored by the West or are authentically doing this in the interest of the people. Some people are speculating that this is an American-sponsored coup. I just haven't seen enough to believe that. But regardless of that fact, we can see that the Guinean people have been trying to push Alpha Conde out of power for a long time. And again, the ECOWAS will act in the interest of their own selves and not in the interest of West Africa. He also did something very interesting. He was stressing that the African Union should have a seat at the G20, a group of 19 plus European countries that work to meet the world economic challenges. So he's asking for inclusion inside of a body, the G20. And if you don't know what the G20 is, they are essentially, many of them are the same countries that are in NATO. And these are the countries that come together to push the militaristic interests that are going to be for the purpose of economic interests. And this is all to the benefit of the West. He's asking for representation of an African country at the G20. That's literally asking for representation of an African country at an imperialist meeting. So these are the things he was doing at the United Nations. What else has he been doing lately? There has been criticisms coming from the Ghana president, because if you don't know, India has a vaccine, it's called Covishield, and this vaccine has not been accepted by Western countries because we know that the vaccines for COVID, a lot of this is political. So they're saying, you'll have some countries saying you can't have a vaccine unless it was made by our country and still come into our country. And it's kind of like this political football, a way for the pharmaceutical companies to exert their interest inside of this global pandemic. He criticized it and termed it unfortunate and said that some countries in Europe that are not recognizing the Covishield vaccine in India for travelers truly are making retrogressive steps. I'm quoting him right now. He says, "What is intriguing is the fact that this vaccine was donated to African countries through the COVAX facility. The use of vaccines as a tool for immigration control will be a truly retrogressive step." Now, I'm going to come back to, the whole immigration control statement, but just keep in mind that this is what he said in regards to Africans from Ghana, particularly, but the Africans in the continent, when they try to travel to the UK. The UK has a 10-day quarantine rule, regardless of if you are vaccinated by this specific vaccine. And of course, we know that most Africans cannot travel to the UK. So this is a certain subset of Africans who are affected by this issue. And then we have Nana Akufo-Addo, who is the Pan-Africanist leader, the child who everyone loves because he consistently appeals to the African diaspora. And while you may feel rightfully that the African diaspora does have an interest in Africa, does have an interest in Ghana, and does have an interest in everywhere where the African people are, we should also understand where we're being utilized to push for the continuation of a two-class system inside of our African countries, where we join the bourgeoisie and not enforce class struggle against the current system. Now, Ghana's president, he heralds historic agreement to build a world-class WEB DuBois Museum complex. He said the museum will provide Ghana yet another important monument to the collective struggle of the African people to get their rightful place in this world, he said. As a historic partnership arrangement between the government of Ghana and the W.E.B. Du Bois Museum Foundation affiliate in Ghana. And if you don't know, W.E.B. Du Bois, obviously, he was a Pan-Africanist leader, particularly in the later years of his life, and he died inside of Ghana. He was welcomed to the country by Kwame Nkrumah, and he's buried there. Right where he's buried, there's a museum already that is dedicated to him. But they're going to basically be doing a multi-million-dollar museum complex to further, his legacy. The complex will be designed by Sir David Adjaye, renowned Ghanaian architect and designer of the Smithsonian Museum of the African American History and Culture in Washington, D.C. The Du Bois Memorial Center in Accra, where Du Bois and his wife, Shirley Graham Du Bois, are buried, will have a library, it will have a reading room, an event hall, an outdoor auditorium, an amphitheater, a lecture space, guest house for visiting scholars, and refurbished bungalow where W.E.B. Du Bois lived and worked until his death. Now, this again is something that will be painted as an aspirational thing that he's doing because, again, he's appealing to the diaspora. But the question has to be, do these things that are painted as Pan-Africanism actualize in actions that are going to propel the masses of the people? And I keep emphasizing the masses because just because you see a few Africans who look as though they're doing well under the current system, that should never be a substitute for seeing the many Africans who living inside of these countries actually doing well. So let's call into question right now, does Pan-Africanism simply mean building museums, simply mean advocating for immigration policies and the benefit of your people when it comes to going to the UK? Does it mean joining the G20? Does it mean all of these things that have no substantive use, I would say, to the masses of African people? Well, I would say no, obviously. And we're going to look at a specific issue that is involving Africans in Ghana to show why it does not. Now, so before we go further into this story, we're going to just briefly go over some African news that's happening throughout the African world. And then we'll come back and speak specifically about how Ghana is pushing out the Liberian refugees who have been inside of the country since the 1990s. So even if I don't respond to everyone's comments, I do try my best to read everyone's comments. And one of you commented that I need some background music for this session. So I'm going to start some background music right now, and we're going to get into some of the news that's happening throughout the African world. Migrant Roundup tops 5,000 in Libyan sweep. The numbers of immigrants who were rounded up as part of Libya's unprecedented crackdown exceeds 5,000 people. This includes children and women. Dozens of them are pregnant. The raid left a migrant shot dead and at least 15 others injured, the United Nations said. And of course, we don't know. Libya, the country right now, is basically a proxy government of the United Nations. The crackdown began Friday in western town of Gargashesh, a major hub for migrants in the North African country. The tally dated October 3rd and obtained Monday showed the roundup netted 215 children and 540 women. Among them, as I said, 30 were pregnant. Now, here's the thing. The Libyan forces describe the crackdown as a security operation against illegal migration and drug trafficking. If you don't know, since Libya has been completely decimated as a country, whenever Muammar Gaddafi was pushed out by the Western powers, the country has become a hub for things like drug trafficking and trafficking of human beings, many of whom are Africans who are trying to use Libya as a way to get from Africa to Europe. Libya has emerged as a dominant transit port for migrants fleeing war and poverty in Africa and the Middle East. The UN's humanitarian coordinator for Libya has criticized the raids in which unarmed migrants have been harassed in their homes and been shot, but the Interior Ministry which led the crackdown, made no mention of any traffickers or smugglers being arrested. It has yet to address the casualties among migrants and alleged abuses during the raids, including one of lethal force. The European Union, which has come under fire for its support of Libya's domestic efforts to stem migrants crossing in the past, condemned the use of violence because they have to. The EU spokeswoman Nabila Masrali said that the Union had been calling on Libya to find alternative system for the arbitrary detentions and managing the migrant population. Although she says we fully support the Libyan sovereignty, the EU also strongly supports Libyan authorities refraining from the use of lethal force. So what is this? Another instance, obviously, of the West trying to paint something as if they're against it, but they're clearly not, because they don't want for these migrants to get into Europe. And because Libya has become a cesspool for human traffickers, migrants who are trying to escape their situations, trying to cross the Mediterranean. Because this is the case, this has led to Europe trying to push for the Libyan government to essentially do these types of mass arrests, do these types of arbitrary actions. And even if violence is used, that's not against their interests. So we should recognize it's not an instance where they're trying to call for the right thing, but where they're calling for things to be done more diplomatically so that they do not face public scrutiny for the support of the Libyan-backed government. Y'all excuse me if I sound nasally. I'm dealing with a cold right now, but I want to talk about the Panama Papers. So Uhuru Kenyatta, the president of Kenya, who has marketed himself as being an anti-corruption politician, has been found to have been stashing millions of dollars in offshore accounts, along with a bunch of European billionaires. So he, in response to this revelation, has, interestingly enough, kind of said that this will go a long way in enhancing the financial transparency and openness that we require in Kenya and around the globe. His offshore investments, including a company with stocks and bonds worth $30 million, were discovered among hundreds of thousands of pages of administrative work from the archives of 14 firms and service providers in Panama and the British Islands and other tax havens. Now, this is very much something that we should not be surprised about, but at the same time, it just shows how stark the differences are when you look at how the people who are put in power are completely living off of the misery of others, because those who are at the bottom, who are dealing with a completely different world, they don't have any avenue to things like offshore accounts. They're literally at the mercy of a government to do right by them and to stop robbing them. In the case of Kenyatta, right now he's facing a starvation crisis. 2.1 million people, which I reported last week, are at risk of starvation. This is not just poverty. Starvation means literally, I don't have food to eat today. And while this is happening, you have the Kenyan president stashing away $30 million. And keep in mind, this is not all he has, I promise you. These are things that they were able to find. But the fact is, these neo-colonial puppets are guilty of self-enrichment on a consistent basis. And until we get to the point where we realize we have nothing left to lose if these people are no longer in power, then they're going to continue to use these positions as a way to exploit the people. It also should be noted how coy his response was, essentially saying, Great, you guys found me out. This will help transparency in Kenya. That's because he's not afraid. He knows that ain't nothing going to happen. He's very sure that the people are not going to be able to do anything because Kenyatta, like many African presidents, are so closely aligned with Western interests, but in particularly with the United States, that they have the military backing to stay in power even when they're looting their own people. So this is, unfortunately, a commonality of many Africans while we suffer and struggle against these neo-colonial systems that allow these types of horrible outcomes to be the case. Now, this isn't necessarily African news, but it's important for us to know because it's how the CIA does things very covertly. If you don't know, Julian Assange, who's the founder of WikiLeaks, he is currently incarcerated. I believe he's in London. Well, it turns out that the CIA and the US government under the Trump administration, but understand the CIA doesn't change regardless of the administration, they all have the same people in there. They were discussing assassinating Julian Assange, and this was going to be a way to stop WikiLeaks from leaking government information. Now, of course, this is illegal by international law. Of course, this is illegal by US law. And of course, this is something that if we actually are understanding of it, puts a lot of people at risk because essentially when you do things for the people and out the people who are making horrible decisions, this is the way that they deal with our people. So because of that, we do have to understand the nature of these imperialist institutions and understand that it's very much something that's pertinent to us. If we don't react to these things, if we let it happen, if we let it keep going by and don't pay attention to these stories, then this just reinforces the system and the mentality of these people that they can continue to do to us as they wish. Lastly, the WHO, that wonderful institution that has received so much press as far as the COVID-19 vaccines. How is it that this story has just gone under the radar? Inside of the Congo, the leader of Congo has condemned the World Health Organization's group for sexual abuse of local women. This is sexual violence that was committed by WHO agents, allegedly, that took place in response to the Ebola pandemic between 2018 and 2020, an official source said. The commission set up by the head of WHO after revelations in the press denounced the structural failures and individual negligence. He said he was sorry to the victims and promised severe consequences to those responsible. In its long-awaited report, the commission found that at least 21 of 83 suspected perpetrators were employed by WHO, and that the abuses, which included 9 allegations of rape, were committed by both national and international staff. The review team has established that the presumed victims were promised jobs in exchange for sexual relations in order to keep their jobs. Many of the male perpetrators refused to use a condom, and 29 of the women became pregnant, and some were forced to later abort by their abusers. I tell you something. If we had the platforms, if we had the ability to truly vocalize the many abuses that have been done to African women and still are being done to African women by the powers that be, if we had those platforms and that empowerment, the Me Too movement would pale in comparison, because this is something that has been historic and consistent. You have these do-gooders, or whatever you want to call them, people who are there to help. There's always been a culture where those people come in and get to live without any scrutiny for what they're doing to the populations. Meanwhile, they're committing these types of atrocities. I remember hearing about similar things with Haiti. Whenever you had the UN peacekeepers coming in, and many people complained of sexual abuse. So this is what happens, unfortunately, when you're powerless. And this is what has happened to African women all the time because of the powerless nature of our people, is that we don't even have a form of accountability. Who's going to hold these people accountable? The most WHO will probably do is fire these people. But by all accounts, I'm very sure that there's going to be no prosecutions. I'm very sure that they'll get to live their happy lives. And I'm very sure that there'll be no healing for the trauma done to the women who have been abused sexually and raped. So this is why we have to organize. This is why we have no choice, because things like this, things like the poverty, Things like the assaults on our children, these are things that will never be corrected as long as we're a powerless people who are at the mercy of really people who have proven historically to be our enemies to come into our jurisdictions and do the right thing by us. Clearly, this is a conflict of interest to them, and they don't want to see the people healed. They want to, they're fine with causing further trauma to a people who are already devastated by the colonial system as it exists. So this is a story to continue to watch because it is just a very clear example of how powerlessness can lead you to being inside of a position where your bodies are completely at the mercy of your enemies. Okay, so let's get into this story. Ghanaian president gives the green light for the demolition of the Buduburam camp, refugee camp. The green light from President Addo follows a 3-month ultimatum that was given by the chiefs of the Gomoa district to the government of Ghana to demolish the Buduburam refugee camp on the grounds that the camp is being used as a hideout for prostitution and other crimes. The government, stated an official, should get rid of those buildings over there. I think the place should not be a hiding place where people do a lot of things that do not speak good of Buduburam. So I am pleading with the government, said Chief Atta, to get rid of those buildings over there so that the place could be vacant and we could use the place for social amenity. Now, President Addo supposedly has given the go-ahead to demolish the place. The district chief executive has asked residents of Buduburam refugee camp and settlement around the camp to relocate or risk their properties being destroyed. The camp itself is a 141-acre land, and they are clearing the area. The chiefs held a press conference and issued the ultimatum saying, following that, we have had meetings with various stakeholders and our request has been granted. So very soon the camp will be closed and the entire area will be cleared for the development in order to change the image of the town. That's very interesting, obviously, that they're saying they're clearing this refugee camp where Liberians have been staying for decades for development, because that to me tells me that there's some type of foreign investor who's trying to get access to it, and that's the reason why they're acting. Now, the response has been from a lot of, I've been, looking at comments and looking at certain videos. The response from a lot of Ghanaians seem to be that there's this image of the Buduburam camp being a place where all the criminals are. And this is a place, again, primarily inhabited by Liberians, that this is the place where all the crime is dangerous, and all these things. This is not at all different when you look at the same sentiments from other African countries whenever there's a different African nationality living inside of their borders. We've seen, for example, during a lot of the South African protests, a lot of the crime was blamed on Nigerians, or I believe also blamed on Zimbabweans. We've seen this inside of different parts of Africa. Whenever something is, whenever there's a crime, even if it is an immigrant from a different African country that commits the crime, it gets exacerbated. And I don't want that to be lost on anyone, that it's very difficult to actually prove a causal connection between one's nationality and any crimes committed, because again, we are all Africans. True, some of us have been traumatized more so than others, but that should never give us the right to cast a broad brush over our African brothers and sisters, that you must be the ones who are disturbing the peace. You must be the ones collectively who are at fault. And let's just say, let's say out of, and again, this is just numbers I'm throwing out. Let's say out of 1,000 Liberians, let's say 100 are committing crimes. Does that give you the right to completely uproot the 900 that are abiding by the laws, that are taking care of the responsibilities, that are not causing harm? And if your answer is yes, then you should understand you're a part of the problem, because propaganda has given you the idea that you are morally superior to a people, even whenever they're inside of their time of need. But this is what's happening in Ghana. Now, this is the narrative that's being said, again, by the officials who have co-signed this, including Addo's administration, that this place is a place where there's a lot of crime and things happening. It's important to also give voice to the people, what they say about what's actually happening on the ground.
I'm confused because I'm standing in the territory of the venerable Dr. Kwame Nkrumah, where he said the unification of Africa, the independence of Ghana is meaningless until you have the total unification of Africa. I'm seeing the way Liberians, Sierra Leoneans, and other nationalities have been treated here. Liberians, to be precise, Liberians benefited from an integration process that is inconclusive. Nobody is coming to speak to them. Nobody come to speak to the Liberians. Their situation is very pathetic. Every morning they will come and give threats of demolition. It is a pain. Just 2 years ago, the president and the Republic of Ghana was brandishing the year of return, calling Africans to come back home. They are driving Liberians here. It is very unfortunate.
My brother,
the DCE will say one thing. When people go to the Ghana Refugee, they will say another thing. We don't expect this for Ghanaians, because if you go to our countries, our fishing industry is run by Ghanaians. Nobody harassing Ghanaians. Why are they harassing Liberians here like this?
My brother,
it's unfortunate.
It's a sorry state you refer to this as a harassment. You have been served notice from 2010 when this camp was decommissioned. Why would you perceive this as a harassment?
The word serving notice is even a mockery. How can you serve notice to me without concluding the process that you have on hand? There are processes that they have on hand. Even the passports to Liberia, they're not giving them. They have refugees here that the UNHCR have accepted their status. They have not come to talk to them. They have people here that they call dismissed. They say they are coming to talk to them. They are not come to talk to them. Recently there is a meeting right there where OB called all the refugees that those who have refugee status should start going to school. While you have meeting 48 hours ago, you are bringing Caterpillar to come destroy your African brothers. It's unfortunate. I'm in pain this morning.
My brother, I'm very interested in the process you mentioned. Is it only to do with passports, or that there are other processes? And what have you done as an opinion leader to mobilize your people to engage the process so that it comes to a smooth conclusion?
We have been engaging this process tirelessly. Yesterday we have a meeting with the residents, with the head of this camp, Obi, the camp manager. He's not even telling us anything. He became a spectator here while our brothers and sisters are languishing. It's a pain. And above all, my pain this morning is that presently the ECOWAS head of the ECOWAS chairman is Ghana. How can Ghana be?
Some angry residents of the Buduburam camp, popularly known as the Liberia camp, have threatened to defy a directive to move out of the camp by Thursday, September 30th. The residents insist they have nowhere to move and will face off with anyone who attempts to forcibly eject them. According to them, the Liberia embassy has neglected them since the Ghana government asked them to return to their country. One of the people said nothing will make them move out of the camp, adding that they are not criminals, as is being speculated. They disclosed that the Gamoa East Assembly has given some refugees 400 cities, each to seek a new place. 400 cities is not a lot. I don't have the math, but I know that, let's see, 400 cities divided by 6 about, so that's almost about 66 American dollars that they're giving someone to go find a new home. Yeah. However, some of the Liberian refugees and residents of the camp have started packing their belongings out of the camp. They accuse the government of deception, stating that they were promised houses and money, but those promises have not been fulfilled by the government. After the beginning of the Liberian Civil War in 1989, the Ghanaian government established the Buduburam refugee camp in 1990 in response to the arrival of displaced Liberians in the country. After a final ceasefire agreement in 2003, the UNHCR repeatedly urged repatriation of refugees to Liberia. The pace, however, was sluggish among the remaining Liberians in Ghana due to precarious political and economic environment. Many Liberian refugees in Ghana have been hoping for a third resettlement with peace restored in Liberia. Most no longer met the criteria for resettlement. So this is a very devastating situation, because this is one where Africans, again, are put inside of a situation where they're left without any alternatives. What am I going to do? You know, I've been living here since the 1990s. I have nowhere else to go. My children have been raised here. Liberia might not be inside of a civil war like it was before. It has not fully recovered and not able to accommodate all of us. So what do? Do you tell those people, here's your 400 cities, go find a house? We're more likely than not, if you demolish their homes that are already standing, there's just going to be a situation where it's a bunch of homeless people. Then what are you going to do? Are you going to forcibly forcibly take them and ship them back to Liberia, where they have no groundings any longer. They have no establishment any longer. And this is where Pan-Africanism does come in. Because if you understand that these borders are colonial borders, Nana Akufo-Addo, if you understand that these borders were created by your colonists, not by your free and independent people, then you will understand that being a Liberian does not make one less African, does not make one less your brother and your sister. And if you recognize that nationality as something worth being treated ill, then you are recognizing racist concepts that have been fed to our people. And that's something that is being lost. Unfortunately, so many I see are falling into the narrative. These people are committing crimes. These people, they're just engaged in prostitution. Let's understand, first of all, if they were committing so many crimes, are they committing crimes because of their morals, or are they committing crimes because of their economic situation? Because crimes of poverty should be analyzed as being crimes of poverty and not crimes of moral depravity. Unfortunately, so many people who pretend that, their ish don't stink don't have that concern as far as what's driving the situation, what's driving social conditions to deteriorate. I know for a fact that Ghana does not have jobs for most Ghanaians. And so obviously, if you're living inside of somewhere and you're not Ghanaian, the situation is going to be even worse for you. Have you given them a job? Have you offered them a job? No, you were expecting someone to make do whenever the situation and the environment is impossible to make do. And you're being, in my opinion, just as ill-willed to your brothers and sisters as the colonists would have you be, because these are instigated conflicts. These are instigated. They're instigated agreements by the colonial system. And I would wish that we'd have a requirement that for people that come and wave the Pan-Africanist flag, people that like to quote Nkrumah, people who like to go to these conventions and go to the United Nations and stand up for Africans, those people, will you please do actually have a true devotion to the ideal of Pan-Africanism, because the very first step would have to be recognizing that the difference between a Ghanaian and a Togolese is literally a border that was drawn by someone who is your enemy. The difference between a Ghanaian and Burkina Faso, that was drawn by someone who was your enemy. They wanted to conquer you. They didn't have your good in mind. And frankly, if you think about how the borders were drawn, they were drawn in such a way that each individual African country would be unable to sustain on its own and would need their outside colonists in order to be able to be self-sustaining. So when you are emphasizing these realities, this is what we are, this is the border that we have, you're not doing anything forward for your people, but you're actually doing things to keep us backwards inside of colonial times. You're pushing us back to before the 1960s, whenever Africa started decolonizing. Now, it should also just be known that this camp was built by the former president of Ghana, Jerry Rawlings, someone who I would say a lot more than Akufo-Addo, while he certainly wasn't perfect, did live up to the ideals many times of Pan-Africanism. This happened as a result because, as we know, Liberia broke out into civil war in 1989. The country was plunged into 7 years of anarchy and mass bloodshed. And as a result, Liberians were fleeing, trying to save themselves. They were caught inside of a situation of being subject to violence. I'm going to sum this video up by just saying that if we're true to the ideals of Pan-Africanism, we cannot pretend that someone is a Pan-Africanist when they're willing to disregard their African brothers and sisters because of a different country that they live in, or they perceive them as being less than. Meanwhile, they'll go to the oppressor and beg for a seat at the table, where the oppressor is making decisions detrimental to you. Or they'll be inside of the position to try to isolate people whenever they push their dictators, their neocolonial dictators, out of power. This is what people do when they're not committed to the ideals of a free Africa. And so I would ask people, before you make these leaders the spokesperson for you, have standards and stick to your standards. What is the standard of someone who's truly devoted to African people and not devoted to the continuance of the colonial system? Write these things out. Make sure that the people who you advocate for, that you put on your channels, that you put inside of your WhatsApp conversations, make sure that these people actually are adhering to the principles of someone who is not for the continual colonization of your people. Otherwise, you are being used, and you have to understand that if you're being used by the system and the system finds you usable, then you're not any threat to the system, and you're certainly no ally to a Black liberation movement. So this is really the end of my spiel on this horrible conflict. Now, I do want to emphasize that it's not been finished, or the resettlement has not been done. And I'm very sure that this is for, when I say for development, I'm very sure that there's some outside person that's trying to get access to the country. But I just want to emphasize that this is not completely done. People are still there, and we have a chance to speak up for our brothers and sisters who are dealing with this situation and call on the Ghana government. We call on the Ghana government to do right by the people who are at this settlement, to not push them out, because these are people who are most at need. And if you want to be the Pan-Africanist hero, if you want to quote Nkrumah in your speeches, then at least live by his principles, at least live by the heart of someone who was devoted to African people, regardless of their national borders. So that's all I have on this particular subject. I look forward to hearing your thoughts, and I will see you on the next video. Hey family, this is Tierney Cherie. I'm here to make an announcement that I'm very, very excited to make. I'm excited because I really think this is something that is important for our people. Otherwise, I would not have devoted so much time and energy towards it. So I finished my first book, and the book title is Fostering False Identity: The Child Welfare System's Design of Social Control of the Black Family. Now, why is this book something that I think will be very important for our community? Well, number one, it's dealing with the system of white supremacy, particularly the way that the system has targeted our children. If you don't know, our children are literally our future. Without our children, we have no future. And so understand that the system is very crafty when figuring out what to derail first. And to me, it's no mistake that the system particularly went after the Black family. If you look at what happened whenever we were enslaved by this system, and continues to go after the Black family, continues to go after Black children, continues to try to villainize African parents. So for that, I wanted to particularly talk about this subject. Now, the other thing that the book will deal with is our African identities. Why is it that our African identities are a threat to this system? Why is it that whenever we want to identify ourselves as being African, we get so much drawback inside of the Black community? I think a lot of us are not aware of the history of assimilationist thought inside of our community, this idea that we have to be close to white in order to be accepted. And so that's another subject that we delve into in this book. So I'm hoping that anyone who is, obviously, if you're a parent, a Black parent, and you really want to understand why it is that these systems are going after your children, I encourage you to read this book. I hope that it will arm you with a lot of knowledge and a lot of foresight, not just about how to protect your own children, but how to organize in your community, because that's really the purpose of the book, is to say that we have to organize among ourselves in order to protect ourselves from this white supremacist system. And then obviously, if you're an organizer in general, this is something that I think is important for you to read, because like I said, this is a subject in the Black community that we just don't discuss enough. Child welfare is not something that is going to get enough attention. People, obviously, will organize them around other causes, but this is one that is really important that I feel like we have to pay more attention